Hi, and welcome back to JAMA Network Open Live. I'm Seth Truger, Digital Media Editor for JAMA Network Open.
And I'm Mike Berkowitz. I'm the Electronic Editor for JAMA and the JAMA Network.
So our first paper today we're going to talk about is the association of sugary beverage consumption with mortality risk in U.S. adults, a secondary analysis of data from the REGARD study by Lindsay Collin and colleagues, including senior author Jean Walsh, who's joining us today. Welcome, Jean.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the study? First, some background. This is secondary from the REGARD study. What was that paper about?
Well, the REGARD study was a national study to look at stroke risk among U.S. adults. So is designed specifically to look at stroke risk. So it was collected over several years, and we saw an opportunity to use these data to look at a question that we had, and that is the risk that's associated with sugary beverage consumption and heart disease and mortality risk. So we use this existing data to try and to look at consumption at baseline and what adult risk was 6 years later.
Okay, and I saw just for some definitions for sugary beverage, you looked at basically sodas that have sugar in them, not artificial sweeteners, any sort of other juice flavored drinks, and then also separately 100% fruit juice.
Yeah, that was part of the opportunity that we saw with these data is that there's been many studies that have looked at sugar sweetened beverages, and the evidence is building about them as being having some health risks. But one of the questions that we've had is how different is fruit juice, which is compositionally pretty similar to sugar sweetened beverages. They're both basically sugar and water, though juice has a few vitamins and minerals. But so we wanted to see, given with the cardiovascular disease risk, was there any difference between the two? So that's why we looked at them in combination, because people consume them in combination, and then separately, so we could kind of suss out this question of fruit juice only.
And you used food frequency questionnaires, is that right?
Yeah, we did. That's how the data was collected initially, asking questions about sugar sweetened soda consumption separately, and then fruit juice consumption. So it was basically what people perceived to be in those beverages. If the respondent perceived that they were drinking a soft drink, it went into that category. If they perceived that they were drinking 100% fruit juice, it went into that category.
And as a researcher, what's your instinct for how well and accurately people remember that?
I think there are issues with that. I think increasingly in recent years, that's been a little bit more mixed. I think historically, when you talk to adults about 100% fruit juice, they're going to know it better than kids today, for sure. Mm-hmm. So I think looking back in these data, it's decent. And I would say that the results seem logical from what we've seen from other data. They make sense. So I think I feel pretty good about the consumption data as it's been reported.
Yeah. So as far as the results, the first thing that really blew me away was how many people were consuming both soda and fruit juice. That 97% of the respondents had some sort of regular.
Yeah, and they asked. Yeah, to get at regular use, or to get at any kind of consumption, they asked about frequency over the last year. So kind of generally how often. So that it might be and we can categorize them to look at those who consume less often. So it might be they don't drink it very much, but they do drink it.
Sure. Okay. And tell us about the main findings. What were the effects? Or the associations.
The associations.
Excuse me.
Associations, yeah. So we saw that when more sugary beverages were consumed, that there was an increased risk of mortality. So, and again, I want to highlight this was not a huge study, which a large number of people in it, but there are not that many people died during the period of follow-up. So we had 1,000 people that died of any cause, and we had 60, and I can't remember, that died of CHD mortality. So it was substantially fewer that we could say that their mortality was attributed to coronary heart disease. So we were able to see when in looking at this that the risk of dying earlier than expected was greater the more sugary beverages were consumed. So we looked at it two ways. We combined sugar sweetened beverages with fruit juices and calling them sugary beverages, and could see an elevated risk. And then when we separated them out and looked at fruit juices alone and sugar sweetened beverages alone, we could see similar associations. The statistical significance was the estimates were a bit higher with the fruit juice than the sugar sweetened beverages, but essentially pretty much a similar association.
And you adjusted for diet as an additional variable.
Yes.
What does that mean? What's in that variable in terms of the adjustment?
Yeah, well, we looked at saturated fat and fiber, and then we also adjusted separately for total energy intake. And when we do think that this effect that we're seeing between sugary beverages and negative health outcomes may be in part due to the excess energy consumed, the excess calories consumed, and maybe the weight gain that results. So in the final model, we also included total energy, and we could see that dampened down the results a bit and attenuated them a bit, but still in the same direction. And so it looks like that's a part of it, but doesn't explain the whole association.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have the graphic for table 3 to show what the different models show, and basically from model 1 through model 4, there's just more and more adjustment, if I'm describing it correctly.
Tried to show what factors were having an influence. Yeah.
And then as you go down, it's a kind of increased percentage of total energy that the individual is getting in their diet from these sugar-sweetened beverages. So some of it might just be, or some element of it is probably just a dose response of pure calories, as you're saying, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So we know that there's pretty good evidence that when you drink sugary beverages, caloric beverages that have calories in them, and not many other nutrients like sugary beverages, that we don't compensate for them as well. So we're not likely to eat less food later as a result. So we're seeing that in a lot of different studies, and that's why we think that in part where the increase in obesity risk comes from is because people just don't compensate. They don't kind of recognize that they're drinking as many calories or consuming as many calories when they consume it as beverages. Yeah. So that's why this whole total energy thing is important to account for.
Yeah, how I've heard that described before is like you don't get full from drinking fruit juice as opposed to eating fruit. And this is something where, I have to say, this is one of my favorite types of studies because it tells me something I already believed in. My wife. Yeah. So I know my own I recognize my own biases. My wife's a dietitian, and she's kind of said forever, 100% fruit juice is one of those things that's almost a scam where it seems like it should be healthy, but from her point of view, it's just a bunch of calories.
Well, so let me ask both of you. It's been a while since I've looked into it, but my understanding is that there's no legal meaning to the term 100%, right? I mean, because you can have 100% fruit juice that's from concentrate. You can have 100% fruit juice that's squeezed from a fruit, and that may have added sugar and still be 100% fruit juice, right? So I wanted to know if that.
Well, actually, the definition of 100% juice, it can be from concentrate, but generally not have added sugars.
Okay.
So, and that's a distinction that I was real interested in for a long time, and then the more I thought about it, but really whether it's added sugar or naturally occurring, they're the same sugars. Mm-hmm. So that's where it became more of an interest for me to understand, looking at the sugary beverages in combination. And when we, even in this population, we see 8.5% of the calories that these adults consumed were from these sugary beverages, which have questionable minimal amount of nutrient value. And in an age where we're a large percentage of the population, 60 to 70% are overweight or obese, we really have to look at where these extra calories are coming from. And it seems like beverages is a place we really need to look. And we looked at it in adults, but that we're certainly interested in juice consumption and sugary beverage over the life course, because by age 2, kids are drinking 8% of their calories from 100% juice, less from sugar-sweetened beverages, but it kind of transitions over time to more sugar-sweetened beverages and less juice through adolescence and early adulthood. So it is a feature in our diet, and we really do need to understand what the implications of the consumption. And I think as with most things, moderation, a little bit probably isn't a problem, but and it's important to understand that our results are comparing to the lowest consumers, and it's not the non-consumers. We didn't have enough non-consumers to compare to, so we compared to those drinking one serving, or in another way drinking less than 5% of their calories. So basically, we can only say that the risk that we see in this paper is above that level, above that first serving, above that 5% level, and it's really important for people to understand that we didn't show a risk with any consumption, because our comparison was the one serving a day. So we expect that there may be a little bit of risk with a kind of a dose response with a small amount of consumption, but I don't personally think that that's the case. I think small amounts are probably okay, but we just have to be careful about the quantity.
And I have another follow-up question for you and your wife. So I can buy 100% fruit juice that has no pulp, some pulp, or lots of pulp. And I know this study doesn't get at that, but what's the thinking about that these days?
Get to real fruit, the better. I mean, the best is real fruit, whole fruit. If we can consume most of our fruit requirements is whole in the whole form, that's going to be better for us. The less, and then from there, the less processed, the better. So fruit has fiber in it. It's one of the great things about fruit. And most of the juices we consume do not. So if you buy it with fiber, you're one step up above those who buy it without.
Okay. Right.
I don't know. I can't stand pulp in my orange juice, so
well, I'm going to come in and add it then, because I want you around.
Well, but but I just basically don't ever really have juice that doesn't have alcohol in it. So
right. Yeah. What about mimosas? That's the next study, right?
Well, that's more of a wellness question. So one thing I found interesting was the way this study was designed. There was a kind of big focus or oversampling in the stroke belt, basically the kind of mid and upper south. And I never heard the term stroke buckle before. What does that do?
Well, and that wasn't part of what we really looked at. That was just looking at around the edges where there is a lot of stroke, but isn't as much, So it's an area that it also has a fair amount of stroke. But there's this area through the southeast of the United States, they have a lot of stroke, and really no one knows why. And so that's where the original regard study was developed to try to kind of understand that. And there's been several papers from that. But yeah, for us, we just had a large adult population that we had the opportunity to kind of look at this diet and outcome.
Great. I think you've answered all my questions. Really appreciate the paper, and you're submitting it to JAMA Network Open. Congratulations.
Well, thank you for your interest. I appreciate it and your questions.
Great. Sure. Thanks for joining us again.
Take care.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
What do you have next?
All right. Unfortunately, now a bit of a darker mood. The trends in suicide among youth aged 10 to 19 years in the U.S., 1975 to 2016, by Donna Ruch. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm probably not, and colleagues.
Right. So this really kind of takes your breath away and is a somber paper, as you propose. And tell us what the title kind of tells the study question, but this is really a psychiatric epidemiology question.
Yeah. So basically, they use the CDC Wonder database, which is basically the CDC's big epidemiology of how people die in the U.S. Looked at it over a few decades, sliced and diced data in a couple different ways to look at a different bunch of subgroups, and essentially looked at how young people are committing suicide and how that's changed over time. Pretty much all the meat is in Figure 1, which unfortunately we were, the suicide rate was increasing for the first kind of 2 decades. Then there were some gains from the mid 90s to about the around 2007 or so, and then now we've not only caught up but kind of continuing on an upward trajectory.
Right. So suicides in this age group, age 10 to 9, are increasing. And the point that this paper seems to make is that this gap between young men and young women, I think we can call them that in this age group, is decreasing. That characteristically boys completed suicide more successfully than girls, and that gap is diminishing.
Yeah. So boys and men of all age, I think, have pretty much always had higher rates of completed suicide, and unfortunately, girls are now catching up.
Right. But while taking that very seriously, these graphs or charts look parallel to me in terms of their increase. So where does that data come out of the paper?
Math, I guess, is probably the main thing.
Numbers?
Yeah, I think the increase, that last part of the upswing that you see, it definitely does look pretty parallel to me. But I think if you're comparing it overall, it's certainly more narrow in that kind of last quadrant than it is anywhere beforehand.
Yeah.
And especially when they're at the previous peak around 1993, there was a much bigger gap, and that peak seemed to be mostly boys at the time, boys and young men.
Right.
And now it's certainly narrowed a lot.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I don't know whether we reproduced Figure 2, but you'll have to go to JAMANetworkOpen.com and look. But Figure 2 shows a declining incidence rate ratio. So an incidence rate ratio is the number of boys who complete suicide over the number of girls who complete suicide over different periods. And basically what it shows from the beginning of this period, from 1975 to 91, boys completed suicide more than girls. But towards the end, between 27 and 2016, that ratio decreased. So, so I think it's unclear Well, it's unclear to me, and this may not be representative of the paper. I think the authors attribute it to an increased success of completing suicide by girls.
Yeah, there's definitely seem to be higher rates of suicide among girls, or an increasing rate of suicide among girls. It's been going up a fair amount. And also when it comes to methods, I guess one glimmer of hope here is that there's been no change in rates of poisoning or firearms, at least in the ratio from male to female. But that girls are catching up to their male counterparts in hanging and suffocation.
That's awful.
Yeah, it's really terrible.
And did you get a chance to look at the editorial?
I read it last week a little bit.
Okay, because the editorial makes clear that these data can't tell us why there's that difference, and yet they call out social media as an historic, meaning previously unavailable kind of variable that in other studies completely unrelated to this clearly is having psychological and psychiatric effects for adolescent girls and young women in terms of their stress and other emotions that might lead them to attempt or suicide.
Yep. And I'm going to apologize. I'm far from an expert in this field, and I'm probably using some of the wrong language as it is. But I certainly remember having read and been taught how there certainly seem to be like suicide clusters. Like when one young person in a community commits suicide, it's not uncommon for peers or near peers to be higher rates in that area, like say in a town. So with social media kind of broadening one's community to a bigger circle, that certainly seems plausible. We don't have the data in this paper from that,
right?
But it certainly sounds like that might be part of it. There was a paper that came out a couple weeks ago and got a lot of media coverage about the Netflix show 13 Reasons Why.
I was going to mention that.
Yep. Yeah. And basically it showed if you look by month, the month that 13 Reasons Why, which is about youth suicide, came out, there was a spike in suicide rates at that time among teens. Yep. When I looked briefly at the data, it looked like one kind of outlier month and a kind of linear trend. So it's hard to know how much of that was a sustained trend versus one spike or just a transfer in time. I heard one podcast talk about it with people who seem to, at least reporters who looked into it a little bit of detail, but it seems like the producers and distributors of the show could have been a little more responsible in how they dealt with teen suicide. And that, who knows which way calls or arrows go and all this sort of stuff, but it certainly seems like things could have been done a little more delicately for a potential public health problem.
Right, or maybe not even produced and distributed the series. I think JAMA Internal Medicine published a piece using Google data that showed spikes in Google searches for suicide and how to complete it, or search terms like those after the episode airings on Netflix. So that's met a lot of public outrage, but for whatever reason, what I call the broadcast platform, Netflix, and the producers somehow don't feel like there's any modification to that movie series that they need to make. There's data yet to come to demonstrate that that's one of the issues. We're not saying that that particular series is contributing, but it is an example of the kinds of exposures that youth have that we didn't have growing up and that no one had pre-2007, because I think 2007 was the launch of the iPhone, right? And so there's just so many more cross currents and signals that can be distressing. And in fact, the editorialists say increased social media use may have a more deleterious effect on girls, providing one potential explanation for why young girls may be increasingly vulnerable to suicidal thoughts and behaviors. That's totally speculative. But as you can hear from our conversation, these data are so upsetting that if we're human, we have to struggle to kind of understand why it might be happening and figure out if there's anything we can do from a public health perspective to help these young women.
Yeah, and my wife and I have a young daughter, and she's well below the age of being on social media, and my wife's terrified. She's always scared of bullying and things like that, and basically is there going to be no break from that at home? Something I spend a fair amount of time on social media is that, as one of my colleagues puts it, social media is everyone's highlights reel. So it's easy to see like, oh, this person did that thing fun and that person did that thing fun. And they don't show each other, you don't show yourself washing the dishes and doing homework and you show the cool vacations. And
right, but I'll see that encounter you with a lowlights reel because it's where all the cyberbullying occurs also. And I think, based on my kids' experience, kids are getting these phones as young as 5th grade. I mean, they're getting them as infants now, right? They're not using social media,
Right.
but they're potentially exposed to things that we used to have control of as parents from a much earlier age. And so it is upsetting, but we as health and public health professionals need to keep getting the data and understanding what we can do.
Yeah, and again, not to be totally negative, there are some platforms that do good jobs with things. For instance, Google is pretty generous with, if you search for most things about suicide, the first thing that pops up is a little header with a suicide hotline, people to talk to, things like that. I'm pretty sure I've seen stuff like that on some other platforms as well.
Right, and the personal digital assistants, or whatever they're called, Siri, Alexa, I think have been, after something that JAMA Journal of Medicine published in 2016, that those voice assistants didn't really understand those kinds of queries about domestic violence and about suicidal thoughts, were quickly corrected so that they can provide people with the resources, mainly phone numbers and people to contact to get help.
Right. All right.
Okay.
So moving on. Sorry for the downer note.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, not all science is happy.
Right.
All right. So just going to run through the table of contents. Another, I guess, disappointing study. There's a study looking at comparative effectiveness of behavioral interventions on quality of life in older adults with mild cognitive impairment. Basically, it's a small randomized control trial, or randomized clinical trial, looked at different types of things, ways to address wellness and quality of life from the end of life, and was pretty disappointing overall. Basically, no big improvements. Overall, wellness focused seemed better than like a computerized cognition testing class of some sort. Yoga was better than support groups, but overall, most of the results were pretty disappointing.
So, okay.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
Basically,
I'm interested in the behavioral interventions, but yeah.
But basically, just like having a wellness class at a nursing home isn't going to suddenly make everybody happy.
Okay. I bet you better food would.
Better food. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. Interesting study looking at cancer screening among current, former, and never smokers in the U.S. from 2010 to 2015. And not surprisingly, current smokers are better at getting recommended scheduled cancer screening for things like prostate cancer, pap smears, mammographies.
Does this include lung cancer screening with CT for current smokers? Or
I don't think, no. This was just because I don't think there's a major recommendation on. Is there a USPSTF recommendation on lung cancer?
Yes.
I don't think that was in this paper.
It's based on the single NLST trial, but there that exists, and I think it was 2015, 14.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
hasn't been updated. There's not a lot of new data.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't seen. Yeah, but anyway.
So current smokers do well in getting cancer screening.
Yeah, in doing cancer screening on time.
How do they do in terms of quitting smoking?
Oh wait, I'm sorry. The never smokers did the best. It was the current smokers and the former smokers did a little worse. Although the current and former smokers overall had surprisingly higher rates of anytime screening, but not within the recommended time frame.
Okay,
but
that makes more sense.
Yeah, I mean, and overall, I think, sorry for misspeaking, but overall, I think it's not surprising that people who do better on certain health measures tend to do better on other health measures as far as taking care of themselves.
Okay.
And I'm using terrible language there. It's not all about taking care of yourself.
I understand exactly what you mean.
There's people out there.
Yeah.
It's not always for you. Next up, this is, I want to talk about this just because this kind of stuff always cracks me up, but a case control out of Taiwan showed that patients who have thyroid disease, either hyper or hypothyroid, are less likely to have colorectal cancer.
Okay.
I mean, this isn't just a one-off. There's some other studies apparently that show some linkages between general and specific types of thyroid disease. Apparently people with Graves' disease get more colorectal cancer. There's some sorts of pathophys pathways that are linked in there. I think some of it is just, I don't know, if you have one disease, you may or may not be more or less likely to get another disease.
Right. But the nice thing about these Taiwan studies, and I didn't look at this closely, is they have like 100% capture through their national health database.
Right.
So even though these studies seem like, okay, well, what do I do with this? Spin this wheel and spin that wheel and see which things are either up or down. Right. It does give a more reliable estimate at a population level that you can't achieve necessarily in a kind of a heterogeneous country like the U.S. or elsewhere. Right,
and also these are problems. These are primarily hypo and hypothyroidism, not fatal things like heart attacks. So it's not like a competing risk.
Right.
So there's probably some truth to it, given that there's other signals that this seems to be in line with. So interesting stuff.
Yep.
Staying in Asia, so there's a valsartan scandal in Japan around 2013. You probably know more about it than I do, but apparently There was a bunch of 5 studies that came out. They were not just industry funded, but some, I'd say, on the higher end of shenanigans, things like industry paid statisticians, et cetera. And they looked 3 years later at the 50 authors from the 5 studies to see who was getting paid by industry. And surprise, 30 out of the 50 were still getting industry payments at that point, on the order of 67 million yen, which is a lot of yen, but
yes.
It's about $590,000 in that 1 year, and not surprisingly concentrated in, I think it was 10 or so individuals. Yeah.
Money talks.
Yeah. Turns out that pharmaceutical companies pay people who are doing research on their drugs. And sometimes there are scandals.
And any discussion in that paper about how things have changed, or is this actually taking the lid off and exposing to sunlight?
Yeah, I think this is just one of those...
Sunlight's the best disinfectant.
Well, it's a pretty good disinfectant.
Okay.
It helps. But as we've seen with a lot of COI stuff, just disclosure alone is not enough.
Right.
And apparently 3 years after being caught in a scandal, the payments are still being made. So sunlight alone won't do it. Some positive news, viremia trajectories of HIV in HIV-positive women in the U.S. From 1994 to 2017. So they took a group of women from the Women's Interagency HIV study, which basically followed women getting their HIV care for decades. And from they originally recruited in 1989, so the tail end of the meaty part of the HIV epidemic, and have followed them since then. Did some fancy things, broke them into groups of how they thought people were going to be either high, medium, or low levels of viremia. And basically, everyone's doing really well now. I think pharmaceutical companies are not always bad. There are some good drugs out there. HIV is getting pretty well controlled, and most of these women had very low rates of viremia, so below 200 counts.
And who was the population? Was it all women with HIV, or all women with HIV prescribed highly active antiretroviral treatment?
I don't remember the details of that.
Because the drugs work, and we should be thankful for results like this. But it also depends on whether they're kind of capturing a group of women who are truly adherent or more likely to get the drugs and so on.
Well, I mean, I think if you're in a study from 1989 to 2017, there's a little bit of bias there.
That's true. There's lots of dropout and maybe some drop back in.
And there probably was some of that stuff too. And this was also centered in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and DC. But it was pretty good. And even in the highest risk group, which was about a third of the women, the rates were still only about 40%. And if you look at the graphs, they're really dramatic. It's just this big drop off, and it's one of those things where it's hard to imagine how decades ago HIV was, an incredibly terrible disease that barely even made it to chronic for most people, and now is a disease that's very easily controlled for most people.
Right, and is a chronic disease at this point if people are adherent to their meds.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and if they're able to be here and able to get access to them, all that other stuff, all the stuff around that. Right. Next up, deep learning. So AI can do pretty well in grading endoscopy photos of severity of ulcerative colitis.
Okay.
That's about it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was area under the curve of 0.97.
That's amazing.
That's about as high.
So this is across the JAMA network, we're accumulating demonstrations like this about the ability of machine learning models, which are kind of self-learning, to do images, to read images and interpret them in clinically meaningful ways.
Yes, and as a little bit of a biostats geek, one thing I found is a 0.97 area under the curve, which is, as your gasping shows, is impressive, was only an 83% sensitivity, but 96% specificity. Which speaks to me of how specificity always sounds better than it is. So you need to, in order to get that very high area under the curve, sensitivity is not great, but really good specificity helps you out a lot.
Well, the C statistic, or the area under the curve, is a measure of discrimination. It says the probability that if you were faced with a person or an image with versus without, how likely is it that this algorithm will get it right? But that doesn't predict a diagnosis in a patient, for example. So the clinical measures are something other than these things that we commonly report, which are kind of statistical descriptors, not clinical descriptors.
And just not to get too much in the weeds of the biostats for our audience, but I think, again, the overestimation of specificity or how much specificity numbers that look good aren't great is most tests that we do, the actual portion with the problem is pretty small. So specificity, which only tells you about the group that doesn't have the problem, like 95% specific means that 5% of a much bigger pie isn't accurate.
So you use specificity to rule in a diagnosis and specificity to exclude a diagnosis.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the spin snout classic.
Yes, exactly.
So next up, assessment of accuracy of waterfall plot representations of response rates in cancer treatment published in medical journals with senior author Vinay Prasad. And basically waterfall plots, which have gained more and more popularity and have been used in a lot of things, they looked at them in a bunch of different oncology journals, and essentially they were overestimating effect sizes in a couple different ways. Not through like terrible shenanigans, but just some kind of artifactual things, like stuff that is well over my head, like the I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but RECIST 1.1 criteria.
Right, yeah.
Did I pronounce that okay?
Yes, I believe it is.
But it's like how you grade remission in a study, or response rates in a cancer trial. You can have a tumor that decreases by 30%, but doesn't quite meet size and stuff like that.
Do we have a figure to throw up there?
No.
We didn't prepare
No,
one. So
not for the table of contents
okay,
stuff.
that's fine. A waterfall plot is basically, you've seen it before. It's kind of little bar graphs above a line, an equator line, and little bar graphs below from kind of left to right. That's a waterfall plot. And this lead author, Vinay Prasad, has been really tenacious about making sure that the methods by which we are describing the effects of cancer treatments are truly accurate and clinically meaningful, and that we are adopting drugs or practices that are truly evidence-based rather than spun in a particular way, or not necessarily even spun, but misrepresented through incomplete or not entirely thought through statistics. And he had a great tutorial on his Twitter account. So if you go to, I think it's Vinay Prasad you will hear his take on it, specifically with links to this article. And he's been a good friend to the journal. So if you're watching today, thanks for everything.
Yeah. And so a reader is asking, what is area under the bell or area under the curve? So anybody who's looked at diagnostic studies before has seen what's called the receiver operator characteristic curve, which basically has sensitivity across the top and 1 minus specificity across the side. I forget which way it is.
Right.
And basically, the better
Can
the
you
test.
hold that up to the camera?
I'm going to. I got to draw first.
Okay.
And the better curves are, so a straight line is a area under the curve of 50%. Do I need to get closer?
Yeah, just move it right on up there. There you go.
Area under that straight line at 45 degrees is basically just random chance, so 50%. And generally, good tests get closer and closer to an area under the curve of 1, so that those curves that go higher and higher up. So that's just one way to assess diagnostic tests.
So a curve of 1 actually follows the axes and contains 100% of all of that information in that box. And that straight diagonal line is 50%, meaning it's no better than chance. And most tests or models that predict things fall somewhere between 50 and 100%. And as we said earlier, the AUC, the area under a receiver operating curve, is basically equivalent to a C statistic, which is I think that comes from the word calibration for regression models and so on. It's basically the same thing. It's a measure of discrimination. This test, or whatever this intervention is that you're using to kind of figure something out, how well does it discriminate between a patient with versus a patient without an illness, a condition, a disorder, a finding, and so on.
Yeah. It's one of those things that's at the same time both very simple and very complex, and we're going to stop talking about it now.
Okay.
We could go on for a long time.
Yes, we could.
Yeah. Where were we? So anyway, so the point isn't that there's these like terrible shenanigans where people are fudging the numbers, but just by their nature, the waterfall plots will include some bars or some patients in the bars that look more favorable than they technically are, because they're not, say, meeting these RECIST criteria or intention to treat for patients which were assessed or patients with dropout and things like that. And that's just, you end up with a not inaccurate picture that's on the page, but there's a little more paint in there, a little more colored ink in the part of the graph that looks a little better. And there should be basically between 6 and 12%, depending on how you're measuring it.
Good.
Yeah. All right. This next one is a little tricky because some difference econ stuff. So these authors looked at hemodialysis industry groups that were buying up hemodialysis centers.
Yes.
And essentially found that all of the centers, both the ones they did and did not acquire, did better as far as mortality and hospitalization over time. But that, not surprisingly, the corporate groups that were buying the dialysis centers were buying better performing centers in the first place.
Oh, is that right?
And then the improvements in mortality and hospital admission in those acquired centers, so in the ones they bought, were less than what happened in the places they didn't buy.
But they still put it up on marketing billboards, right?
Yeah, of course. And so part of it just might be that they're buying the ones that look good or that are doing well and then squeezing money out of it and not doing anything nefarious, but the other centers are catching up to them. It's possible that they're doing things like, say, cutting costs or staff loss in the transition, et cetera. They looked over a 3-year period, so a lot of that should be gone out in the wash. But basically, it looks like with the difference analysis they did, there could have been better improvements in the centers they acquired.
And did they account for patient selection?
I think so. I think they did those kind of usual adjustments, stuff like that. But I think this is essentially, my guess would be, having looked at this data somewhat and in more detail a number of months ago when this paper was getting considered. I didn't make the decision on this one, but I remember looking at it. A lot of it was, it was probably selecting better performing places in the first place because they're the ones you're probably more likely to make money on, and if you're a corporate dialysis place, that's what you want to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just really interesting, and especially the level of analysis here is interesting.
Right, and that's a new kind of paper for us, so it's good for us and interesting to talk about.
Yeah, and economics in general, especially health economics, difference really hot right now.
And we have a JAMA Guide to Statistics in Medicine and Methods piece that talks about differences kind of analyses. So just search for that on our website. It's not a JAMAnetworkopen.com paper. It's a JAMA.com paper. You can do a Google search for that if you're interested in methods.
Yeah, and basically one of the things that's economists like a lot about difference is it potentially shows causality in large retrospective observational data.
That sounds strong to me.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
I've heard more than a handful of economists suggest that you can infer causality from it.
Well, the economists may say that, but they're not in our shoes.
That's what I'm saying.
Having been burnt by inferring causality from observational studies.
Right. And also, I've seen at least one really good tweet tutorial from an economist showing some of the ways that the causal inference from it can be misleading. But most of this stuff's above my head, and I'm generally skeptical of everything. So
the difference, let me just lay it out because it's not as complicated or scary as it sounds. If I understand it correctly, it's the change in one group before and after versus the change in other, and then you get a delta, which is the difference between it's the change score, the change difference, with a confidence interval around that. And there's lots of useful information in that confidence interval because the change could be as little as the lower limit or as high as the upper limit. Right. Anyways, so it's not that scary. It's pretty intuitive, even though a lot of statistical packages and authors make it sound complicated. Right. The idea is pretty basic.
The principle behind it is pretty simple. I'm still skeptical that you can infer causality from it.
I agree. I'm totally on board with you.
Yep.
Okay.
It's was it neat, simple, and wrong?
Yeah.
Right.
Nasty, brutal, and short.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's even worse. You're more cynical than I am. Lastly, this is one of those great papers that shows something that's pretty obviously true, is that adolescents and young adults who are found to have marketing materials for alternative tobacco products like vaping are more likely to initiate vaping.
Really?
Yeah, so marketing works among teens.
So we just published, hot off the press in JAMA Pediatrics this morning, this estimated analysis, which is really interesting to me if you're a social media geek, as I am a little bit, that they basically estimated the ages of the followers of at Juul Vapor. And they estimated that really of the active accounts, nearly all of them were people ages 22 and younger, which isn't that surprising. This was a research letter. It doesn't kind of, it's not breaking news per se, but yes, young folks are attracted to these devices and are over-influenced by marketing, as we know.
Yeah, and
remember Joe Camel.
Yeah, I mean, just in really simple terms, companies are unlikely to spend tons of money on marketing if they don't think it's working.
Right.
So, and here's some more data that it seems to be working.
Right.
Yeah. All right, so that's what we got today. Of course, you can check out these articles and more from Friday's release for free, open access at JAMAnetworkopen.com. Follow us on all the usual platforms, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, visual abstracts on Pinterest, at JAMA Network Open.
Subscribe to our podcast. I believe that Fred Rivera, who was here 2 weeks ago, and Deputy Editor Steve Finn discussed these two very papers on their podcast. So we're going to have kind of a second podcast in the stream. You can go to JAMAnetworkaudio.com for that podcast and all of them from the JAMA Network, and visit us on JAMAnetworkopen.com for everything we've published. including Fridays at 10 a.m., Greenwich Mean Time -5, for our newest releases.
Right. We're also taking the audio from these broadcasts and putting them in our podcast stream. So if you want a different, easier way to get it, the first segment of the show is going to be, or continue to be, on iTunes.
Right. And that's thanks to Eric Butkus and his team, who's doing that heavy lifting, and he's our producers here. So we never given them adequate props. Hi, guys. Thanks for everything.
Yep. All right. And next week's Memorial Day, so I guess we're going to be on Tuesday, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's call it Tuesday.
Let's call it Tuesday, probably at 2 o'clock Central Time, which is Greenwich Mean Time -5.
Yes,
6?
it still is.
Okay.
Whatever
I
it is.
never remember. I just Google it. All right. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
Take care. See you next week.